Morning, everybody. So it is 10 a.m. So why don't we go ahead and get started? We are delighted that so many of you are joining this at this event co-sponsored by our department, but the flyer neglected to add as well the History and Politics Club, who also were joining us, trying to organize it. So we thank them for this. Just FYI, some students have inquired about the recording because they couldn't make the session today, 10 a.m. So we are indeed recording this session, and it will be posted to our departmental Facebook page, the School of Arts and Humanities Instagram account, and I think Dr. McClellan is also going to pass it on to the admin. So there should be lots of different places you could find the recording or tell people who missed it if they want to pursue it. So as far as format goes, everybody, I thought we would keep it pretty informal and leave a lot of room for questions. So I think I'm just going to give, if it's okay, a brief historical overview of Ukrainian-Russian relations. Then Dr. Martinson, he's the expert, he's going to talk a little bit more about the international relations component. And then we'll go on from there about, again, the situation is changing every day. So I'm sure you have lots of questions and concerns. All right, so first things first, where are we? There is Ukraine. And for those of you who don't speak the language, everybody, Ukraine means roughly translated on the border, on the edge, right? And as you see with the relationship to Russia and Ukraine, that's indeed what it has come to be, a kind of a gateway into Russia. Let's take a step back though. The Russians and Ukrainians, everybody, are closely related culturally, ethnically, and linguistically. Up until 1000 AD, the seat of what we would call Russian civilization was indeed centered in Ukraine. It wasn't called that yet, but what was called Kievan Rus. And for a variety of reasons, in the 1200s, 1300s, that center of gravity in terms of Russian politics, if you will, shifted to the emerging kingdom of Muscovy. Right? As Muscovy began to expand over the succeeding centuries, everybody, right? It encroached more and more and absorbed various areas of modern day Ukraine. But Ukraine continued, parts of Ukraine, modern Ukraine, also continued to be ruled by the Ottoman Empire to the south and the Austrian, what would become the Austrian Empire to the west. But from about the 1600s on, right, Ukraine more and more was formally incorporated into the Tsarist Empire, from where it remained until the dissolution of the Tsarist Empire in 1918. Ukraine as a nation state, everybody, enjoyed a brief period of independence from the year 1918 to 1921 during the Russian Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, though, they were forcibly reincorporated in what would become the new Soviet Union, where they would remain until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. They had a very ambivalent relationship in the Soviet Union, everybody. In some ways, as part of broader Soviet nationality policy, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, right? Ukrainian, what we would call affirmative action programs were promoted by the Soviet state. Right? In some ways, Ukraine therefore became more ethnically and linguistically Ukrainian than it had even been under the Tsars. At the same time, there were periods of repression. Most notably, I'm sure many of you heard, the Great Ukrainian Famine of 1932 to 1933, where it's estimated up to 5 million Ukrainians starved to death in an entirely man-made famine. They would literally, under Stalin's orders, be shipping out train loads full of grain while people were starving on the train platforms. Ukraine also suffered years later, everybody, disproportionately during Stalin's bloody purges of 1937 to 1938. Entire Ukrainian elites were decimated. With the fall of the Soviet Union, everybody, in 1991, Ukraine, like many of the former Soviet republics, became an independent country. Russia, however, continued to refer to these former republics as the so-called near abroad. Right? Technically independent states, but part of what used to be the Russian and Soviet orbit. As such, Ukraine, everybody, has enjoyed a very ambivalent relationship with Russia since becoming independent. Like many of the former nations of the Warsaw Pact, right? The Baltic countries, Ukraine has sought closer political, cultural, economic ties with the West. Russia has seen that as potentially a threat, an encroachment into its sphere of influence in what in many ways still considers its rightful territory, the so-called near abroad. So that's a lot of information in about 2 minutes, but I will just leave it at that. I could circle back to things if we have questions, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Martinson.
Hey, I'm sorry to have gotten here a bit late, and probably Greg already added this, but just to put another wrinkle in, after Stalin killed those however many million Ukrainian peasants, he shipped in several million ethnic Russians who still lived there.
Yes.
And he's counting on them to support a return to Russia. And it's not clear how many of them will.
And those, Dr. Novak is absolutely right. And those ethnic Russians are predominantly in the eastern part of the country, especially those two breakaway republics that Putin has been trying to kind of sever off of Ukraine proper.
Yeah.
Thank you. Greg, would it be possible to share a screen?
Yeah, of course.
I have my own map to share. I want to pick up with talking about the expansion of NATO and the inclusion of what is historically known as the Eastern Bloc into the fold of NATO.
You should be able to do it, Jeff.
Okay, it looks like I can do it. Oh my goodness, I have my rather inept Zoom skills on display for everybody. All right, so here's a map, hopefully you're looking at, of Europe, and this is the current membership of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You can see that it was founded in 1949 as a response to Soviet threats, or the expectation of Soviet threats right after World War II. As you probably know, the short-term alliance between the United States and other liberal countries and the Soviet Union was integral in ending World War II and succeeding in defeating the fascists, but that quickly broke apart at the end of the war. One thing I'd also add to what Greg said is that during World War II, many Ukrainians, by no means all, in decreasing numbers over time, saw the Nazi conquest of Russia as a liberation from that oppressive regime. Again, they came to realize how much worse it was under the fascists, and not all saw it that way from the beginning. So that's where part of this commentary on eradicating the Nazis from Ukraine comes from, I suppose, is sort of a historical memory of them being traitors or turncoats in the past, in the eyes of Russians. So NATO steadily expanded throughout the Cold War period, including countries like Germany, Spain, Greece, and Turkey. But it reached a point in the early 1980s where it was sort of at its maximal extent. Other countries like Sweden and Austria were never going to join. But then with the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, its breakup into constituent parts, the alliance expanded again, first by including East Germany with the reunified Germany, and then moving further afield into countries that had previously been part of the Warsaw Pact, which was the equal but opposite communist military alliance. And immediately that stuck in the craw of the Russians. From the very beginning, there were complaints from, at the time, Yeltsin, that this would be provocative, that this would be a threat against Russia. Russia has a long history of claiming encirclement and containment as a diabolical plot of liberal countries to destroy the revolution. And, from their perspective, that's certainly valid. So in any case, the West failed to heed those. One sort of offer they made was to create an auxiliary organization called the Partnership for Peace, which included NATO and non-NATO countries, including Russia, in sort of the process of trying to make sure there was physical security on the continent. Again, not heeding these warnings, the expansion continued, and they weren't just listening to the Russians, obviously, but they're also listening to the wishes of the people in the countries of the Baltics, which now involved countries that had been part of the Soviet Union, as well as other Eastern Bloc countries like Romania and Bulgaria, and countries that during the Cold War had been kind of neutral, although communist, the parts of the former Yugoslavia. And so as far as Russia is concerned, this is an encroachment further and further into their, as Greg said, sphere of influence, their rightful area of control and supremacy. And all of this had a huge speed brake thrown on and really slowed it down in 2008 when Georgia, which is a Caucasus country over here, bordering between Russia and Turkey, had gotten a little too ambitious, perhaps, and I think even in the West, there's a sense of this, that their leader ended up absconding from the country, and now, of all places, he's in Ukraine. But they made loud noises about joining NATO, and they would have been yet another former Soviet constituent part joining that, further encircling Russia as far as it was concerned. And now the new leader of Russia, Putin, in 2008, decided enough was enough, and he invaded Georgia and put paid to those ideas of joining NATO. It similarly cooled the heels of the Ukrainians and the West as far as that country joining NATO, but not entirely, because these are contradictory processes. On the one hand, Russia threatening, if you expand, we're not going to like it, we might attack you. And then that threat itself giving justification for the expansion, for joining the organization. Further justification for that came in 2014, when, as a result of changes in the domestic politics of Ukraine, Russia had again had enough and decided to first upset and cause a sort of a concocted revolution in Crimea right here, and then to annex it, and then to concoct a revolution all over Ukraine, but a lasting one in the Donbass region over here in eastern Ukraine. And that brings us up to February of 2022, this year, the invasion, when it started just like Ukraine, in a sense, with the recognition of those separatist regions. They probably have just been too busy to annex it, but that's probably their next expectation. And then the claim that this special military operation is geared towards basically removing the government of Ukraine and neutralizing it militarily, what the Russians call denazification and demilitarization. And NATO is over here on the border of that war. And there is a lot of turmoil, a lot of unity too, but a lot of hand wringing about what exactly it can do, what it can't do. And you know, I'm as much a student of that as all the rest of you are, because we're learning on the fly what those parameters are. And so that's the background. I would add the international context. You can't see it on the map, but if you don't know, the United States and Canada are also members of NATO, really important members of NATO, obviously. And they too are in this mix, but so too are these many countries. And the last thing would be to comment on the European Union, which is not NATO, which is an economic and political organization that stands for capitalism and democracy, which are as anathema to Russia as the independence of countries in their near abroad. So both these concepts are threats to the Russian definition of security.
Yeah, I would just add, if it's okay with Jeff, to dovetail on that. One of the central defining myths articulated quite often by Putin, increasingly stridently, is that NATO, following the breakup of the Soviet Union, NATO gave explicit assurances to the Russian Federation that they would not expand NATO to the borders of the former Warsaw Pact countries. Now, participants on both the Russian, European, and US sides all argue that is patently false. Russia was never given any such explicit assurances. Nevertheless, you could look at it two ways. From the Russian side, they would argue, yes, we were given no explicit assurances, but Russian considerations as a legitimate great power, right, with real security interests, a formerly hostile alliance expanding to its borders, Russian considerations and grievances, if you will, should have been given more attention by the West. In 1997, there was a charter signed between NATO and the Russian Federation saying that we do not consider ourselves adversaries. 5 years later, there was a board set up, an executive board, if you will, that were supposed to handle consultations. But from the Russian point of view, everybody, what NATO does was always make their own decisions unilaterally, then inform Russia after the fact and try and get them to agree to it, again, which Russia does not consider full consideration. On the other hand, playing devil's advocate, Russia might have gotten more consideration if it hadn't spent the last 15 years bullying, intimidating, and invading its neighbors. As Jeff said, right, it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Russian fears of encirclement, both militarily and democratically, have led them to bully and invade their neighbors, who then look to closer integration with NATO and the US. So what Putin has long feared, he's in a sense made happen. And that's where we are right now. Short note, everybody, sorry, I should have gone into this. I was rushing through my history, I apologize. But just to give you an example of the relationship between them, ethnically and culturally, the Russians refer to themselves as the Great Russians, to the Belarusians as the White Russians, and to the Ukrainians as the Little Russians. They're kind of poor country bumpkin aunts and cousins out there on the plains, as opposed to supposedly the culturally, technologically, more politically more sophisticated Great Russians. And that, you know, that relationship, which was under the Tsars, very much continued into the Soviet period, despite, as I said, certain ways they promoted Ukrainian nationalism as well. David.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Could I throw in one other
Sure.
variable just for a second? Jeff, could you put that map back up that you just had?
Which one?
NATO and Russia.
Sure.
I mean, Greg may have already pointed this out, but another variable
It's coming.
goes back even further, and it's part of Putin's thinking. I mean, 300 years back, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Russia controlled all of this.
Yeah.
This vision of greater Russia extended all the way into Eastern Europe. And Putin, instead of having portraits of himself in his office, have got statues of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great and Ivan the Great. And that's got symbolic meaning for the Russian people, and he's playing on that, but it also seems to mean something to him. And it may not be his main motivation, but it's part of his motivation. I mean, he seems genuinely to believe he's kind of restoring or carrying on the tradition, of this 300-year-old vision of Russia.
Michael, I would say it's a very powerful part of his vision. Again, I've been telling my class when we've been talking about this, don't underestimate the power of the irrational in international affairs and the motivations of leaders. Many Russians, most notably Putin, just never reconciled themselves intellectually and emotionally to the fall of the Soviet Union. They saw it as the dissolution of a great power, in part sabotaged by the West, a profound humiliation on the international stage, and especially when I lived there in 1994, 1995, with plummeting life expectancy rates, increased alcoholism, the difficulties of transitioning to a capitalist economy. Many Russians who I befriended felt profoundly humiliated and marginalized. I mean, I remember being on the streets in a market in Moscow where they were selling chicken legs, and they called them bushya nogi because they were part of aid from the first President George Bush administration. And many Russians found this humiliating, that they're buying American chicken legs on the street at a Moscow market. And Putin has really played into that sense of humiliation and marginalization, and he will restore glory and the proper Russian national pride. So yeah, Michael, I don't think that's a small part of it. I think that's a very powerful part of it.
Question is, how many of them will buy into it?
I see a hand up. David?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to hear you both comment about public support for Putin. It's clearly Ukraine has cast its lot with democracy and capitalism over the past few years, and that's some of what's driving Putin. And some people have referred to Russia as a convenience store with gas pumps, meaning that their economy is about the same as the capitalization of Amazon. So they don't have a very robust economy for the number of people they have in the country. And so would the average Russian, knowing what they know, and that's probably pretty limited, feel like the Putin-led government is doing the right thing for the Russian people? Or is this purely the fantasy of Vladimir Putin, who's living under the mythology of the last 300 years?
Jeff, can I take that one first? Well, first, David, it goes to what the average Russian knows. And over the last 3 years, Putin has built a system of repression and censorship that many argues is worse than the Soviets in terms of controlling what the Russia knows. Independent media, which thrived for a short time under Yeltsin, has essentially been emasculated. Russia, again, they've censored Facebook, all these things. So again, it's an open question what the average Russian knows. I would also say that at least in the short term, this restoring national glory gave Putin the benefit of the doubt, especially after the chaos of the privatization years under Yeltsin. Again, David, which was a time for many Russians of incredible instability, unpredictability, suffering. Putin promised law and order, national glory, return to normalcy. And that worked for a while. I think for many Russians, though, that act has begun to worn thin. Again, think about how many thousands of Russians have taken to the street in protest, knowing the risks. Again, they know they're going to be arrested or worse, and yet they've come out. As David said, the Russian economy never diversified after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's still heavily dependent on gas and oil, raw material exports. So I think it's also, I don't want to spend too much time, but there have been, you might say, chinks in Putin's armor in the last few years. There have been large-scale protests. There have been political opposition figures emerge. Most of them have been neutralized, right? Either knocked off or imprisoned under false pretenses. But yeah, Putin certainly aspires to be a dictator, but it's not as easy as you thought. About the last part, David, again, Jeff might comment on this. I've been heavily involved in reading about this, as you might imagine, like many of us, but especially it's my specialty. I've been really disturbed by a lot of Putin's rhetoric. Putin has been a ruthless person, but he's usually been disciplined and calculating. And the stuff that's coming out of his mouth about Nazis and drug addicts, it just sounds increasingly unhinged. And there were reports of Putin, like many dictators, increasingly isolated from any bad news, right? Just getting fed lies from his inner circle that, oh, Ukraine is going to fall quickly. Things are going swimmingly. And increasingly he's being depicted as kind of paranoid and raging about how this whole thing is going. There was a Russian report from a Russian journalist with allegedly very highly placed sources within the Kremlin that the top Kremlin aides are literally calling this. And she said they had to enunciate it in English, a clusterfuck of epic proportions. And that's feeding into Putin's rage. But I will shut up. Jeff?
Yeah, I would just add a couple more observations. If you want to see a relatively cogent argument of Putin's thoughts, one of his muses is a man by the name of, I'm going to butcher the last name, Sergei Karaganov. And on, I believe it was the 21st, anyway, just days before the invasion, he's a professor, he's internationally renowned. He works across boundaries, but he's an ardent Putin supporter. And he published a document through his think tank called the Putin Doctrine. And it is, like I said, relatively cogent. It gets rather rambling. It's kind of like, Russian literature. It's got to be 800 pages long, but it's brilliant at the same time. And it's an excellent window. And from someone who I think is not necessarily unhinged, again, who has a good reputation as an analyst and a critical thinker, this Sergei fellow. But he basically espouses all the things that we've said about Russian revanchism and the return to glory and the righting of past wrongs, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know very much about Russian domestic policy, but I am intrigued by it. In my heart, in my hope, in my dream, there'll be another velvet revolution, and this thing like the Soviet Union did will sort of crumble from within, and the threat will take care of itself. That's one of the alarming things to me in the loss of media coverage because of the self-exile or the forced exile of reporters from Russia. We don't know what they're thinking. There's been some interesting Voice of America reporting of sort of man on the street views about Russia, and it's good because you can hear what many Russians are saying in support, and it's sort of this blind loyalty to the leader and the administration, which is a human quality, and we see it in our own country from time to time. And the last thing I would say to compare our country to others is Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe. It has a government, a regime type, which is marginally more democratic than Russia's, but it's still what we call in the field a hybrid democracy, which means basically, dictatorship light. These people, the participants in Ukrainian democracy, are literally killing each other. All right, they do it secretly in assassinations and things like that. But past president was removed from office, run out of office for his involvement in the murder of a reporter. And so this is like Trump and Hillary supporters in one country. All right, they really despise each other, but not now. All right, because they have the common enemy of Russia. And I think the galvanizing force of Zelensky, who was already sort of an atypical politician, is bringing them together. And again, self-fulfilling prophecy. Putin wanted a weak vassal Ukraine that would be divided and riven by all these conflicts. He has done everything wrong to ensure that. They will for a long time now be galvanized by this memory, by this experience. And it's astonishing how effective he's been in shooting himself in the own foot.
And I would add to that, Jeff, also, not just domestically in Ukraine, but internationally, there's a revival of the international grades from the Spanish Civil War. I just saw another article on that. Who knows? Ukraine's probably inflating the numbers, but it does seem that several thousand foreign volunteers from the US, Europe, other places, South America, have journeyed to Ukraine to fight on behalf against shades of the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, let's hope it goes better.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe let's take a student first, and then Dan and Michael again. Elise has her hand up.
Hi, I guess this is more of a question for Dr. Martinson, but especially from like an American point of view. And I don't know how like true this article title was, but I saw something somewhere that said Biden wasn't going to send troops to Ukraine. So I guess how are the countries like physically nearby Ukraine and also its allies? How is this going to affect like the neighboring countries and their allies?
Yeah, so that's a prudent step, a deliberate signaling by Biden to say, we don't want to expand this war. We don't want to turn it into a regional or world war. And so, we're doing many things short of that, which, Putin sees all as provocations. Like Greg said, he's upset by the slightest insult, but seriously, the measures we're taking are incredibly damaging to Russia, including in the long term for their physical security, being able to pay for their military, being able to, run their factories, being able to feed themselves. I don't think, it would take decades for that to happen, but we are hitting them hard, very hard. The main emphasis militarily for Biden, it appears to be, is maintaining the unity and defense of NATO. And as David mentioned, we have a significant forward presence there. There are strategic forces that, we can fly bombers all the way around the world from an airbase in the United States to bomb Russia and then come back home. None of us hope that it comes to that or want for it to come to that. The neighboring countries are closer. And so, you know, there's a fear that the fighting will cross their borders. You know, the refugees are crossing those borders now, but it's a regular practice in war for resistance movements to base themselves in neighboring countries. And it hasn't gotten to that point yet, but, you know, there's already been claims, rumblings from Russia about, you know, the complicity of the NATO alliance in countries like Poland and Romania by sending weapons. That's a big concern logistically and strategically for the United States and the other NATO countries. As you probably are aware, we're not giving them soldiers, but we're giving them lots and lots of weapons. Yep. Although some, you know, American contractors and soldiers are going over there, even though our government has requested them not to. But in any case, those weapons are being positioned on the borders in the peaceful part of the world, the NATO part of the world, in relative vulnerability. So if Russia were to be really ambitious, you know, and really concerned, they would just attack those where they're sitting in their depots. And that would be a direct assault on NATO territory and result doubtless in many deaths. And so that would expand it too. They haven't done that either. So we're not sending troops. They're not attacking the supply routes into the country. I'm not even aware that they're attacking the supply trains themselves, although I'm sure the transportation from the border is being provided by Ukrainians. You probably read that the United States is so far putting the kibosh on selling major weapon systems like Patriot missiles or fighter jets or giving them to Ukraine. I think that's also an anti-escalatory measure, but you know, this is moving pretty fast. Yeah. It could happen later that occurs. But I think what I would guess, just sort of trying to be inside their minds, is that they're hoping and they're expecting that the mode of combat that is existing now will be sufficient to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. That you know, Ukraine will be victorious enough with the level of commitment that the West is showing so far.
We also need to remember, and I've stressed to my students the inherent danger of this. Jeff is roughly correctly talking about rational calculation, but once you set military forces in motion, there's a so-called fog of war, and escalation could come by accident. Somebody makes a miscalculation, even a lower ranking commander does something, someone winds up over a border, they didn't realize they were over. So as much as both sides are trying to show a certain amount of restraint, as Jeff said, war is very unpredictable. People are firing at each other, and escalation could come by accident, right? Due to confusion, misassessment, bluff, right? And that's what makes this pretty inherently scary too. Sophia, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah. Hey, Dr. Vitarvo, and
Hey.
Thank you everyone for coming in today. I had a question. With everything that the US has done so far with the sanctions and quote unquote tightening up their grip, do you think we're playing a losing game in regards internationally or domestically? I say internationally because we wouldn't be gaining anything with like actually helping the Ukraine, since it's not a vital interest for the US, or even domestically because of the rise of prices of everything else. And thank you.
Jeff, you want to take that, or I'm happy to, or?
Why don't you go ahead?
All right, Sophia, actually, no, I don't think the U.S. will pay a price. I think one of the things that's really shocked Putin is the display of unity between the United States and the European Union. Basically, what he's done in his acts of aggression over the last few years, he's sought to kind of divide and conquer, because he knows European countries, especially Germany, are so heavily dependent on Russian gas and oil exports. Therefore, more, let's say, hawkish elements in the U.S. have been kind of neutered, if you will, by the more cautious Europeans. I think, which is one of the reasons that emboldened him. They felt that this would be a replay. And that's another historical thing we need to throw out there, Sophia. Under both Republican administrations, under first George Bush, under Democratic administrations, under Obama, Putin has systematically invaded and destabilized Georgia, Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, and essentially gotten away with it and paid no price. I mean, there have been pinprick sanctions, but really nothing to deter him. And I don't want to, torture historical analogies, but like Hitler in the 30s, the more he got away with, the more emboldened he was that there would be no response, and he moved on to bigger and better things. And that, I think, has also shocked Putin, that he thought this would be a divided, tepid response, that, we lodged a few diplomatic protests and but the Europeans need his gas, and I think he's really been surprised by the level of unity by both the EU and the US, NATO. So I don't see us paying a price. And also, Sophia, I would maybe quibble with your assertion that Ukraine is not a vital US national interest. I think maybe it wasn't at one time. I think it's certainly become one now when you look at the larger ramifications for NATO and the EU.
Yeah, I would say that it's been so far, although we're really early into this, and the politics has the attention span of a gnat. So we'll see what we're saying about this. Anybody remember Afghanistan? We'll see what we're saying about this in a year or even a month's time. I think it's been astonishingly successful. I think it has thwarted the plans of Russia. There are some puzzles internationally. The neutrality of India is a surprise and disappointment to many. It goes against the narrative that this is a democracy against autocracy, because India is a democracy, a full-fledged one, not a hybrid one. China, as everyone probably knows, is also supporting Russia, but that's more of a pleasing development because their support is tepid. And so, for example, they abstained on the United Nations resolutions in the Security Council and the General Assembly. It'll be interesting because this is like a moment for China to show its bona fides. It has two masters here. It has autocracy and anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism in particular, which puts it in alliance with Russia. But then it has its economic prerogatives, which really puts it in alliance with the Western world, where it's more important for China to have markets for their products than raw materials to create those products. And so, if they lose the West, they lose much more. And so it's a question of whether they're going to take a political, ideological alliance or an economic alliance. And my hope is that they'll take the latter, but which I hope was what I was saying was the economic one. Also, here's some more mind-blowing things. I was trying to think of three things that would be surprises to you, but I can only think of two. The International Space Station continues to orbit the Earth as a cooperative venture 50-50 between the United States and Russia. All right, and there are Russian and American astronauts on it now. There are no Ukrainians, so we don't have that fight. Another thing that's even less obscure, gas and oil continues to flow from Russia to Europe, and get this, through Ukraine. All right, the Ukrainians who are under attack by the Russians are monitoring, or excuse me, they're managing the pipelines through Ukraine to sell Russian oil and Russian gas to Europe, who have said they'll wean themselves off it, but have not said they'll do it completely. So there is this very strange relationship between adversaries where they are really dependent on each other. So that, I couldn't think of a third one. I'm sure there is a third one that's just the strangeness of war, but this happens all the time, trading between the trenches and all this weird stuff, hey, you got a cigarette kind of stuff, and bigger. You would never think, but that's human nature. You got to have your gas, you got to have your smokes.
I think Jillian's had her hand up for quite a while, as is Asma.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, I have a question regarding to, I guess it's more so based on like social media's approach to what's going on and understanding like how the international affairs are involved. Is it inappropriate or hyperbole to like name this situation World War III, or can that become accurate terminology for what's going on?
Jillian, I think it's premature right now. As
Right.
Dr. Martinson mentioned, both parties have a vested interest in not seeing this conflict escalate on the NATO side versus the Russia side. But again, things get unpredictable, especially as Putin is frustrated and doubling down. Putin, everybody's a prideful man. He is not going to back down. That might be the end of his dictatorship. However, what might happen, as Dr. Martinson alluded to, the more this thing drags on, and it's not a good look for Russia killing civilians, right? A tank opening fire in a car, he might change his definition of what acceptable victory is. There's already some hints at a possible climb down, some type of face-saving. I mean, at the beginning, he was talking about denazification, killing Zelensky, arresting the entire Ukrainian government, all kinds of things. The latest Russian demands have been significantly scaled down from that. But again, it would be a profound humiliation and personal political threat to Putin if this is perceived as a failure. So he will double down. As I said, he might accept a different definition of victory than he had at the beginning. But Jillian, like I said, escalation is always unpredictable. So I don't think it's World War III yet. And certainly I hope it will not become one. But Jeff, did I articulate that well enough? Or?
Yeah, A+. No, yeah, I would just say the same thing. We're not there yet. I don't like that hyperbole. I think it's needlessly inflammatory, pardon the pun. And you know, we can all imagine a lot. That's what we do in academia and in this field, but we're several steps away from that, fortunately. And even, you know, historically, look at crazy leaders in the past, someone like Hitler. You know, he had a scorched earth Gotterdammerung, you know, just everybody's gonna die with me kind of thing in the end, you know, and I like to think that they said, okay, you first, and then immediately afterwards, or not immediately, but you know, shortly thereafter, saner minds prevailed, and you know, they didn't destroy the state for the man. Should we call on another student? I'm sorry, faculty, but maybe we'll continue grabbing students. Ozma?
Asma, yeah.
One last comment on World War III. Putin is a rational actor. He knows he launches his nukes, Russia gets destroyed too. He knows that.
We hope he remains a rational actor right now.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Asma?
Hi, so first off, thank you so much for hosting this informational session. But my question was, with all this talk about the conflict, has there been any talks about resolving like this conflict? Has there been talks between Ukraine and Russia and trying to like settle down before any more casualties happen?
Yeah, Asma, Dr. McClendon just put into the chat. Thank you very much, Dr. McClendon. Russian and Ukrainian delegations have been meeting sporadically over the last couple of weeks in peace talks. The Russians have significantly modified their original demands. Those demands are still completely unacceptable from the Ukrainian standpoint, but at least they are talking to each other. I'm not optimistic about what's going to come of it. But again, as you've been reading from the papers, Russian troops are suffering from low morale, serious logistical issues, shortage of fuel. Again, the constant images of, you know, brutalized and killed civilians on TV is not a good look for Russia. So I would argue, not too optimistically, the pressure is building on the Russians to wrap this thing up one way or the other, because in many ways it's been a complete disaster. They assumed from all indications that this would be quick, it would be easy, the Ukrainians would panic, they would arrest Zelensky, and yet we're dragging on.
Yeah, and I would add, it's a disturbing change development and I would recommend a source called the Institute for the Study of War, which does daily analyses on the situation, the strategic and tactical situation vis-a-vis Ukraine, Russia. And anyway, they're reporting that Russia is bringing in their basically mercenary groups from Chechnya and from Syria. And those groups are well versed at terroristic tactics, basically, and urban warfare, which they experienced in different parts of Russia. Chechnya, if you want to see the precursor to what we're experiencing now, read about the first and second Chechen wars. You know, that was one of the first great achievements of Putin. Was after coming into office, he again avenged the earlier loss or tie of the first Chechen war with a victory in the second Chechen war. And in so doing, he basically killed everybody in the main cities of Chechnya, especially the capital Grozny. And so these urban warriors are being marshaled to the battlefield or outside of Kyiv. There's a group from Chechnya. There's a group called the Wagner Brigade, Wagner, and they are being unleashed. You know, these are groups that Putin doesn't even control, and they are being unleashed. And so that's a sign of desperation on the one hand, but it's also a sign that this may become horribly, horribly worse.
And I would add, and this might sound surprising considering they're my adopted people, the Russians, it's not just these specialist groups, it's the Russian army in general. I mean, I'm teaching warfare class right now. Different countries have cultures of warfare. And, you know, it's not to put too fine a point on it. The Russian army has traditionally fought like savages. They ignore essentially the rules of war. They target civilians. They did in Afghanistan. As Jeff said, they raised Chechnya. I was there during the first Chechen war. So again, the kind of what we would see war crimes and atrocities, right, are kind of a feature and not a bug of Russian warfare. And that's the regular Russian military forces, not to mention these specialist groups, as Jeff said, these Spetsnaz groups that are going to come in as well as mercenaries, and things will get even uglier. Jasmine? Jasmine has left the building. There she
Hey,
is.
no, sorry. We discussed this in your class, Professor Vitaru, but we talked about if there were to be the accident of Vladimir Putin being killed or the accident of him self-harming just to get over with this due to like the extremely wealthy being so upset. Is it realistic to think that if something of that manner were to happen, that we would essentially go back to maybe sunshine and rainbows of like the relationship between the Ukraine and Russia, but then also what's affecting us with like gas pricing and everything in that manner?
Well, it's interesting, Jasmine, that as I'm sure many of you know, Senator Lindsey Graham got in trouble essentially for saying out loud what a lot of people are hoping, that the West's strategy is to make life so difficult for these oligarchs that Putin helped create that they'll find a way to depose him. Now, the devil's in the details. How is that deposing going to happen? I was reading an interesting article about how Putin maintains his personal security from assassination attempt and what have you. But it has indeed been the strategy of the West that if you make life uncomfortable enough for these oligarchs, hopefully they will find a way to depose and or remove or have a sad accident befall Putin. As I mentioned in class, Jasmine, I'm personally skeptical that that would happen. That assumes that these oligarchs made Putin as opposed to he helped make them. From that highly placed article I read about that Russian journalist with source in the Kremlin, many of these oligarchs are kind of in despair about the way this war has turned out. But at this point, I don't see it like the Stauffenberg rats leaving a sinking ship, trying to physically eliminate Putin. If he were removed from power, that would give, remember, he surrounded himself with his cronies as defense minister and prime minister, but it certainly would give the Russians a face-saving opportunity to climb down. They could essentially paint this as Putin's aggression alone. But again, I'm not optimistic. Jeff, what's your take?
Yeah, I say I view it like sort of the devil we know is better than the devil we don't know. So, you know, even the Allies in World War II were suspect of the elimination of Hitler because, you know, at the end of the day, you have to make peace with your enemies. And clearly, Putin is a tyrant with incredible powers. He might not be as great as he thinks he is. There's chinks in the armor and all that now. But, you know, he would be the voice for Russia, I would think, especially as he has started it. You know, if you create a martyr out of Putin, that might redound to actually harm our cause. You know, that furthers their stab in the back myths. So yeah, I'm not a fan of assassination as a means of foreign policy. I think it's generally counterproductive.
Well, again, I think Jasmine's suggesting, Jeff, would it be different if the Russians, someone within the Russian government or his circle managed to do it for us? But
I see.
Again,
That's where I defer to you because I don't know, you know, what even the continuity of government is there. You know, who does it go to the prime minister? I just have no idea.
But again, it's unlikely because again, a lot of them are just as complicit. It's like Hitler making all his top lieutenants complicit in his crimes, you know, so they're all in right now. So yeah, I'm not optimistic. Yes, kleptocracy. Riley, I think we got room for a couple more questions.
Hi, so I support a foundation called Planet Tree Co. And they posted kind of like a summary on their page about what is happening over in Ukraine and their relationship with Russia and how to support people in times like this. And I had reposted their post and mine got taken down for spreading false information. So how do you feel about social media platforms that take down posts like this and like spreading information about what's going on in times like this?
Now, this is a Western social media platform?
It's just like basically kind of like a charity foundation where
Okay.
you can donate money to it and they plant like help bring back like trees and plant trees like overseas to like kind of bring back nature and forestry and everything.
Well, I think it's unfortunate. I mean, obviously, I don't appreciate censorship. Moreover, who's to say what is misinformation? You know, that's very much in the eye of the beholder. So I personally, I'm not a big tech mogul. Otherwise, I'd be probably not working here. But anyway, I personally think that, you know, let people publish things and counter things and let people research and find out the truth. But yeah, Ukrainians and Russians have both accused each other in this current conflict of massive amounts of misinformation. Putin in particular has tried to regulate Russian social media even more than usual. I'm sure you've seen it on Facebook. I think has suspended operations in Russia. So as the old saying goes, truth is the first casualty of war. I think that's happening again.
And did you have your hand up? I didn't notice.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
The Ukrainians have been begging for a no-fly zone, and I was wondering if you could explain for our audience, what does it entail to set up a no-fly zone in a war zone, and what are the potential complications for the United States and NATO if they were to even think about that endeavor?
Well, Putin has made clear that the invocation of a war zone would be tantamount to an act of war, that it would be joining as a belligerent. And there's two things though, Dan, again, I don't want to step on Jeff's toes. You could declare a no-fly zone over Ukrainian airspace, but then for it to have any teeth, you have to enforce it. And who would enforce that but NATO jets, which would put them in harm's way of Soviet fighters. So there you're looking at, I mean, that who was mentioned before, Osmar or someone about escalation to World War III, that would almost certainly guarantee escalation, which is why Putin said it's a red line. From what I've read, again, I'm not an expert, but from what I've read, it's not necessarily the most pressing thing. And I mean, I think Zelensky wants it as more symbolic effort, but the Russian Air Force has not flown nearly as many sorties as would have been expected. They're using dumb bombs. Many of them are getting shot down. Long story short, and this is kind of poetic justice, Russia has touted this very expensive military modernization program over the last decade. Apparently it hasn't worked because who knows how many of those billions were siphoned off by his cronies. So he reaps what he sows. But yeah, the Russian Air Force thus far in the conflict has been in many ways a paper tiger. It's not nearly been, I mean, they haven't even controlled air superiority yet. They're flying kind of simple missions. They're using dumb bombs. Several planes have been shot down. So I think Zelensky wants more, and Jeff could correct me, the no-fly zone as a symbolic act of NATO participation, which would escalate it. And I don't think NATO is going to go anywhere near that.
Could I moot one last issue for anyone who wants to hang around?
Sure.
I half did it through chat. My sister and all her friends who don't read much, and in that they may be typical of a whole lot of Americans, fear that this is communism trying to take over the world again. And I reassured them that it isn't. I don't see that Putin has ever had any commitment to communism. I don't see any evidence that he does, but I may be wrong about that. And I just wanted to see, Greg, Jeff, whether there's any evidence that he's committed to communism as an ideology, or whether this has anything to do with that.
I don't think the communists were committed to communism.
Moreover, Michael, Putin depends on a kleptocratic capitalism. Why would he go back to communism? You know, there's no money in it.
Okay.
You know, I remember having a conversation during the first Chechen war when I was living in Moscow with another visiting US professor. And she said, oh, the communists will never go back. They realized they could loot the country far more effectively under capitalism than they ever could under communism. Now they have villas in Miami. So
Okay.
I don't see anything remotely so about bring back communism.
Thank you.
Sandy, maybe you get the last question. We have like maybe 5 minutes for those who don't have to go.
Thank you so much. You all, helped to answer one of the questions that I had, which was how did Putin think that he could get away with this, with the Western powers and just having few people on his side? And I just wondered what his playbook is, what you think his playbook is for previous examples. You talked about the unpredictability of these kinds of situations and not underestimating the power of the irrational. And I guess that goes, that sort of goes hand in hand. And his pride, he'd rather die trying.
Can I start with that, Greg?
You got it, Jeff.
I'm going to be inflammatory and maybe a little shocking myself. I think partly his playbook is the United States. He is incredibly envious of the power that the United States and more broadly the liberal democratic capitalist countries have to assert their way around the world. Now, I think it's a false equivalency in the main to compare what Russia has done in Ukraine to what the West has done. But if you go back far enough in history, there are instances where the United States was just egregiously or other Western countries are just egregiously assertive and didn't brook any disagreement, would attack democratic or quasi-democratic regimes because they weren't exactly the democratic flavor they wanted. So these were sometimes more covert operations like in Iran or Chile. But the one that keeps coming to my mind is Panama in 1989, when the United States invaded Panama, a country in our sphere of influence, with the ostensible reason to remove a dictator who was oppressing his people. But no one could miss the fact that he was doing all the same things with our support just a short while earlier. So I'm seeing that on social media, when I'm able to see it translated. A lot of Russians and Russian apologists are saying, how come the West can do this whenever they want, but Russia does it once and the whole load of bricks comes down on them. So I think that that's part of the precedent that they're looking to, is this is normal behavior for a great power, and they should be able to do it because they're a great power. What they're ending up doing is something like what Russia did in what's called the Winter War, which I'm sure has also come to a lot of people's minds, especially Greg's, where they, totally fumbled it, not once, but twice. And then China in Vietnam, in their invasion of Vietnam right after our Vietnamese war, when these major powers got trounced by the little brothers in both cases. So that's my thoughts on it, Greg.
All right, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut it off. I really thank everybody for coming. I hope it was informative and helpful. Thank you to our department and also the History and Politics Club for helping to co-sponsor this event. Remember, we're going to try and post it on our department's Facebook page as well as the Arts and Humanities Instagram account, but I'll have updates too. So again, thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it. God willing, this conflict will be over soon, but until then, keep your fingers crossed and your powder dry.
Thanks for putting up with all my blah.
You're good, Michael. You're more than good.